Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Rethinking Iran teach-in on hashtag Mahsa Amini and Iran's feminist revolution. My name is Narges Bajoghli. I am an assistant professor here at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies. I'm so excited that all of you are here with us today on this virtual teach-in. We'll be talking today about what has been going on in Iran, and we have a stellar lineup of speakers to help us understand both the significance of the uprisings as well as what they mean within the broader context of Iranian history and what they mean within the broader context of what we're going through in our current global and political and social moment. Our speakers today are Negar Mottahedeh, who is a professor at Duke University. She's the author of two books that are super relevant. She's the author of many books, but she's the author of two books that are super relevant for our conversation today. The first is hashtag Iran election, hashtag solidarity and the transformation of online life, which is about the Green movement and the ways in which digital media and online spaces were used, both in the Iranian context as well as in a global context. And the book Whisper Tapes, Kate Millet in Iran, which is about women-led demonstrations after the 1979 revolution. We also have SAREH AFSHAR, who is joining us, who is a scholar of performance studies, who focuses on questions of public mourning, the aesthetics of everyday life, the materiality of visuality, and digital and new media in Iran. Neda Shaban is joining us from Colorado. She's a graduate student at the University of Colorado Boulder. Her research focuses on the history and tactics of the anti-compulsory hijab movements in Iran. I'm very excited that all three agreed to join us in such a really crazy and hectic time. I know everyone is busy trying to keep up with what's happening, as well as doing a lot of educating and interviewing with other folks. So in the naming of today's event, we included the terminology Iran's feminist revolution. Now, as a researcher of revolutions, I always tell my students, I know some of whom are watching us today, to be very, very careful when using the terminology of revolution, because it tends to be thrown around quite frequently and quite often to describe things that are not necessarily revolutionary. And so I don't come at this as someone who is eager to use that word all the time, but I really wanted to, in this case, offer Iran's feminist revolution as both a provocation to get us to think about this, as well as an echoing of what is going on in Iran, and especially from many of the women on the front lines of this movement in Iran who are talking about this as a revolution, as a social revolution of sorts. So what we're not doing in this conversation is we're not talking about this as a political revolution and what may or may not happen to the Islamic Republic as a state, although those are all very important questions. Instead, what we're thinking about all together today and learning from one another is how a national or an uprising that has gone through all different parts of the country, at its core is a slogan, a feminist slogan, women, life, and freedom, which is a Kurdish slogan, that comes from the Kurdish women's liberation movements that goes back decades. It is a militant slogan from those movements. So what does it mean to have that be a national rallying cry in Iran? What does it also mean that for the first time in Iran's political history, you have a widespread slogan that is not about the death or destruction about the current political leaders at the helm, but is about the possibility of thinking about life and freedom into the future and having women at the center of that. That in and of itself is revolutionary because it is something that is completely new in Iranian political culture and Iranian political discourse. And that's something that we need to be paying attention to, helping to unpack and helping to understand with one another. Now, I know that there are a lot of folks in the policy and political world who are interested in questions of what this means for the Iranian state and the Islamic Republic and especially in this moment of potential transitions in political leadership, with Khamenei being older. These are all very valid questions, but that's not what we're going to be discussing today. What we're discussing today is that we are forefronting the concerns of the women and people on the streets in Iran. We are centering what is going on with Iranian women, with Iranian society, with young people in Iran, and what we are hearing as scholars of social science and the humanities, and what is going on there and how it relates to everything that we've been seeing and studying thus far. So I invite those of you who are interested in those more quote unquote traditional political questions to also stay with us, because we're hoping that what you will get out of this is destabilizing potentially some of those notions that we have about what social movements, and especially social movements led by women, can mean in a society. So with that said, I want to start with Professor Negar Mottahedeh. So Negar, if you can help us understand what we're seeing in Iran today, and contextualize it. If you can first start with the contextualization in relationship to the women's marches and the immediate aftermath of the 1979 revolution around compulsory hijab, but also other things.
So in my research, what I found was that my research into the revolutionary period, what I found was that Iranian women marched shoulder to shoulder with men and called for the end of the Iranian monarchy in 1978 and 1979. And once he left, once the Shah left Iran, and the undisputed leader of the revolution, Ayatollah Khomeini, came back from his exile from France to Iran. They started the Iranian women themselves started a very different kind of revolution, which was a revolt against compulsion. So it was an uprising against compulsion, much like the uprising that we're seeing today. What happened was that within a few days of his return, Khomeini called for women judges to step down from the juridical system. He called for the elimination of what was then the Family Protection Act, which protected women in cases of divorce, if their husbands took a second wife, which allowed women in certain cases to have abortions and so forth. The third thing he did within 2 weeks of his return to Iran was to say that women in governmental institutions and in the ministries were to wear a veil. And so the next day, after his pronouncement, when women went to work, whether they were part of the government or not, part of government institutions, men started harassing them and asking them to go home and put on a veil. And so as they met each other on the streets, they started to march, and they marched towards the university. And this started a 10-day women's revolt against compulsory veiling, but also to protect their rights as women in Iran. So that's really a historical background to what happened and is what's happening right now.
Great. So Neda, I want to turn to you. Can you sort of take it from where Negar just left us off and talk about the tactics and the history of the anti-compulsory hijab movement in Iran, and what you know and what you've been finding in your research about it in the present context?
So in my research, I found that if we go fast forward to the present time, the other critical moment in anti-compulsory hijab protests is a movement that happened in 2018 named the Girls of the Revolution Street. And that was critical for a couple of reasons. So it was the first time that several women were protesting compulsory hijab by taking off their hijab and using a very specific form of performance to protest hijab in public spaces, in crowded cities of Tehran and other cities in Iran. And so the first woman, Neda Mottahedeh, had her hijab, her white scarf, tying on a stick and waving it on the air when she was standing on top of a utility box in a Revolution Street in Iran, which is one of the most crowded streets during the day in Tehran, and stayed there until she was arrested. So that was the first moment that we could see after 1979 women's marches in the streets, that we could see women protesting hijab so obviously. This movement was followed by some other movements, and this Veda's Act actually was followed by some other participants, protesters, and overall it had a very huge repercussion at the national level. But this movement was also built on a previous movement that was due to a series of social media campaigns that started in 2014. So we see that there is this continuum of continuous acts of resistance and protests that are built on top of each other. So the 2014 movement on social media was founded by a journalist, an Iranian journalist in exile, Mahsa Zhina Amini. She asked women in Iran to send their photos without hijab, along with their stories of being oppressed by enforcing an imposition of hijab on their bodies. And so this act was embraced by a lot of women in Iran. Hundreds of thousands of photos were sent along with the stories, and the stories were really like real. You could connect with them, because that was the first moment that women saw that they are not suffering individually, but a huge population are suffering from the very similar act of oppressing and imposition of hijab on their bodies. I would like here, and this movement was also continued by a couple of other social media campaigns. I would like to make the point that my research shows that this was the platform that bring the voices of women for the first time to bring the discussion about compulsory hijab at a national level. But this was something that happening before that. So usually we see these moments, these critical moments, as an epitome of something that is already going on in the society. And there is a social context here that the society of Iran has been gone under a lot of economic and social transformations starting 1990s. And so a big middle class came to the stage, and also there was this new generations who care about their lifestyle and what they want and their rights on their bodies. They are different, and a lot of them are different from the previous generation during the revolution, even their moms that participated in 1979 marches or did not participate in. But also social norms about how women should dress changed during these transformations. So the social norms that people, like even the patriarchal norms about how women should dress, they transform and they become different, while the compulsory hijab rule as a law still was criminalizing not obeying from those strict norms of hijab. So the law was ratified in a different time than when the protests were actually began. So the subjects are different. We see the rise of new subjects, and that's why one of the reasons that we see so much difference between these generations, and the new generations are coming to the stage with different demands and pushing the boundaries of those restrictions.
Great, thank you for that. So what I'm hearing from you is that it's a combination of everyday forms of pushing the boundaries that women have been practicing in Iran for many years now, the demographic reality of the baby boom generations that came after the revolutionary period, and sort of more global preferences for particular ways of what it means individually to either dress certain ways or not. And then that gets pushed forward by various forms of movement building. And in addition, I think it's also important to note that all of this is happening in the backdrop of multiple forms of women's movement that are also in very much visible in Iranian society in the 1990s and 2000s. Thank you, Neda. So I want to turn to SAREH. SAREH, if you for those of us who study modern Iranian history, particularly, questions of public mourning, especially as they relate to political protest, are very, very prominent. And I know that you've done some really excellent work around this. And so can you please help us contextualize the fact that, Mahsa Zhina Amini first goes viral in Iran because of the coma that she gets put under and the pictures that go around from her, and then her death and what that then does. You're on mute, SAREH.
Of course. Sure. I think regarding public mourning as a trope in Iranian culture, we can go as far back as Sugh Siavash, that's the mourning of Siavash, whose legend goes all the way back to the Avesta. So these are the collected religious texts of Zoroastrianism, and we're talking like 3rd to 7th century texts. Furthermore, there are also texts that indicate that there was a tradition of a mourning cult around Siavash that continued on in Middle Asia until around the 10th century. So first of all, this is a very long history that we're not going to get into today. And as you said, we're gonna kind of look into this particular contemporary context that we're in. And in the interest of time, and as a nod to the tripartite slogan of this uprising, women, life, liberty, I want to break down mourning into 3 categories. And I think that will also allow me to show like where did this kind of the procession that happened around the mourning of Zhina Amini fit into this idea of how we Iranians approach mourning and how it figures into our collective sense of self. So one thing I do want to note is that I left Iran in 2008, and while I've been back for research, a lot of my takeaways and my research come from an analysis of the generation I refer to as the war children, Bachoghli Jang. So these are born roughly like leading into the revolution, we'll say 1978 to 1988, and I'm sure we're going to discuss the generational divide between them and today's protesters later on. But getting back to public mourning, where I locate mourning as playing a fundamental role in shaping collectivity over the past 2 decades in Iran is in the interconnected realms of the politics of mourning, the sociality of mourning, and the performance of mourning. By the politics of mourning, I mean to say that if politics definitionally is considered a conflict between individuals or groups who enact that dissension, basically that conflict in hopes of achieving power, then the political can be mapped onto the structure of mourning in Iran. An example of this would be Ruze Daneshu, or University Student Day in Iran. This happens on 16 Azar, 7th of December. There are commemorations every year that happened because 3 students were shot down in Fani College, or the College of Engineering at University of Tehran, during the time of the Shah, right? And what happened was pre-revolutionary. This was the day that students were trying to commemorate their students, and in those commemorations, they would always have protests against the monarchy. So at that time, they were often met with crackdowns. Post-revolution, what the new regime tries to do is it tries to co-opt and own this day, right? And say like, these students were killed because of imperialism, and, you know, it kind of has its own scapegoats that were actually, you know, this is a part of the history. For the students, however, again, this was a day of protest. So what happens is now, like starting especially with the 1999 student protests that were met with severe crackdowns and kind of are another point of eruption. If we think about this, again, and I also want to go back, Narges, to your earlier point, revolutions don't happen in this like, you know, it's not like, oh, it happened and then it's over. We have these moments that erupt, right? So the 1999 protests were a moment. And since then, you know, this same day that the regime used to vulture as a day in which we should have commemorations has become a problematic day for the regime. They have closed the university. When I was there, I went to UT myself. They closed the university down for air pollution, for example, one day specifically on, you know, that particular day. This was also the first place at those protests was where I heard the chant, for example, death to the dictator, right? So this is one day. Then this feeds right into the sociality of mourning. And why I'm talking about the sociality of mourning versus, for example, social mourning or the sociability in mourning is because sociality is defined as the quality or state of being sociable and is used to convey the act or instance of being sociable. So it's the act that I'm interested in because that act needs actual space. We often think about mourning as needing time to really fulfill itself and be successful, but we leave out the fact that we need space as well. And in Iran, the space becomes so contested. So it's not just about the fact of like, who do we get to call martyr, but it's the fact that in Iran, some deaths are super overmarked and some deaths are fully undermarked. And this has again come to a head when after the revolution, you had the students, for example, who were saying, okay, we have given people who have died for this cause. Can we call them martyrs? And that was something my generation was trying to do, right? Still working within the structure of the state. This is also an instance where we saw that, for example, when Zhina Amini was not allowed space, right? So you have the actual tangible physical space and you have space that is, you have the space, for example, do you have space on television? Do you have space on those murals that are all around the city? So kind of basically having markers for other people and giving room and space for their narratives to actually have a function for people. And the last one is the performances of death, which, you know, if we get to later on, I'll come back to, but really we're thinking about how Iranian popular culture is rooted within Taziyeh and Ashura and what is actually referred to kindly in my generation as the Hussein Party, right? So kind of talking about how those also function as these annual markers. So if we had space, we also have time, annual markers that we dissent and protest in our own ways and get the chance to practice collectivity.
So thank you for that, Saadet. And I do want to get back to the points that you're raising in a minute. Negar, I want to go back to you. Considering what we've heard now and your research on the hashtag Iran election protests, and then, but I want to bring it into the present moment. What are you seeing today that's catching your that's sort of making your, you know, making connections in your brain and that you think are both different than what has happened before, but also really essential to understand in order to kind of get those connections to what has happened before to the present?
So one thing that that Neda reminded me is that the notion of freedom has actually been central to the women's marches and the women's revolutions in Iran since 1979. So during the protests in Iran, Azadi or freedom was the catchphrase of the women's marches. 2018 and the protests around veiling were hashtagged my stealthy freedom. And again, now we have the word the tripartite slogan, woman, life, freedom. So there is this is a point of continuity between these three periods that I've looked at. Another is, and this was actually remarked by Kate Millet, the American feminist who was in Iran in 1979 during the women's marches, was the presence of men participating and protecting women against harassment during the women's marches in 1979. And again in 2018, that's another thing that we saw, oftentimes men in admiration and support, both online and off, of the women who were protesting in public without their hijabs. And again today, we see this. What I see is very different, say, from the post-election protests of 2009, is the mass participation of people of all ranks, of all classes, and also both rural and urban men and women, and people participating from all over Iran, not just, although this, not just Tehran. And this isn't exactly right about the 2009 protests. They did spread, but not as widely as the protests, the women's protests have today. And also the diversity of causes that have that are associated with the call to woman life and freedom is spectacular. And the number of participants globally, a number of people who see themselves implicated by this call in Iran. Women in Iraq supporting Iranian women, women in Israel supporting Iranian women, in Mexico and Argentina, and all over the world, essentially, both online, but more importantly, physically, in person, all over the world. Spectacular.
So Negar, I actually want to ask you a question about this. The online offline component of this uprising, I agree with you, is really quite interesting to see, and is different in many ways from the hashtag Iran election and the Green Movement uprisings, and the way that happened in an online sphere. The fact that strategies that are being learned, the more and more that these hashtag movements sort of erupt, right? I mean, one of the things that we're seeing is that power is so incredibly concentrated, whether in a place like Iran or in many places around the world. And so it is extremely difficult to protest power that is so incredibly concentrated, because there's a monopoly of violence increasingly on one side, and the other side is sort of basically fighting back empty-handed, except with hashtags. Has been a lot of literature and scholarship around the essential quote unquote failures of the first generation of hashtag movements, that they didn't really end up creating the changes that those in those protests were hoping to. But I'm wondering, because I sense that the past couple of years of protests, in which, yes, it's the millennials who helped lead the first generation of hashtag movements, but now we also are joined by those in Generation Z. What is the combination of those doing, and what are we seeing in these new generations of hashtag uprisings that you either see similarities or differences in tactics and sort of how they go viral?
Well, I think that this whole idea of policy change, or the change of government coming out of network social movements, which is essentially what these online, offline movements are, is kind of silly. I mean, I think there are movements that are meant to change people's minds, to change people's hearts. And this is where essentially government power has hold. It's the wanting to have control over people's minds and to have them live in fear. So essentially these social movements that we're seeing are movements that in some way overcome fear through togetherness and speak up against or speak to power in a united voice. So I think this is some of the commonalities that I see with past movements. What's different is the number of coalitions, number of groups that join the women's movement in Iran in support of women's sovereignty and their say over their bodies and life.
Thank you. Neda, how is what is going on today different than the history that you gave us about contextualizing the anti-compulsory hijab movement? What I hear a lot of are questions, especially outside of Iran or among those in the diaspora, that it's like, okay, well, what are the demands, and how are and who is going to negotiate with the state over these demands? And so, how do you think about those questions in light of what is going on today and the demands and the tactics that are being used?
I think one of the differences is that, so during the 2018 movement, there was this huge political context and controversy also. By political context in the background of women's movement, I mean particularly the worsening relationship between the US government and Iranian governments. And we know this history of hijab during the revolution that was actually picking first voluntarily by some women as showing a fight against imperialism, and then was imposed by the state after the revolution, again still as a sign of fight against imperialism, but without regarding the protests of women's the demands of women who did not want to obey that as a rule. So these continue to be still as a pretext to suppress any movement or any protest against compulsory hijab by attributing that to Western countries, and in their attempt to actually overturn the Iranian state. And this is not that much from the reality, as online or social media campaigns against compulsory hijab after 2018 was cooperated by the US government under Trump administration, and that became a source of controversy and disagreements between feminist activists and women who had been participating in this movement in Iran and with some women in diaspora. So at that moment, the Guerrilla Revolution street movement is spectacular because the participants in that were protesting inside Iran, not in social media. They took a great level of risk, and also they distanced themselves from the social media campaigns intentionally, so that to provide a safe space that is not intervened by the intervention of these political forces, international forces, whether this is the U.S. government, or also not giving a pretext to the Iranian government to oppress them. So that this is the demand that we have, and it's independent of, see us as this demand as independently from what is going on in this geopolitical situation that is around us. So I think a difference that I see now is that, so this movement happened and started in a different context. We do not see such political conflicts in terms of, like, it's similar to the ones that was going on in 2018 and 19 now, so we could not see the influence of Western. This is something that happened and started within Iran. It was an ordinary day. It was an ordinary girl coming from a different province, which is like not the center of Iran. is a periphery, if we can, as like Tehran as center and Kurdistan as periphery. Coming to Tehran, was walking with very ordinary style of clothing, and her life was taken because of the rule of compulsory hijab rule. There is no pretext here, like to oppress what is going on and the outrage of people and women's demands by attributing that to this political context. So I think this is important to mention that how now this demand can go forward more powerful, stronger than before, even before. And there is now a space to talk about this, free from this long-standing messy political environment around it. So I think, yeah, this is one difference that comes to my mind. I agree with Narges about the notion of freedom that has been repeated again in these three critical moments of 1979, 2018, and now. And it has a very specific meaning that women are giving to it. Like the stories of women that posted their photos on the social media campaigns that I studied, there is a very particular meaning for freedom. It is not attributed to the states. They were talking about freedom for themselves, their bodies. There is a very clear message: hands off my body, because you are attacking my dignity. And it is so humiliating to be oppressed and to be targeted by morality police or authorities in the university at the entrance doors of universities to talk to me or make me obey this compulsory hijab rule.
Thank you, Neda. That was really eloquently stated. So yeah, part of what we're seeing today is an outrage over the everydayness of police harassment that women face by the so-called morality police in Iran, right? So it is in many ways what this uprising is also about just let us be, to stop policing us and criminalizing us so much. And because it is an everyday incident, and because the women who are on the streets can be as modestly veiled as Zhina Amini was, to completely unveiled, and it doesn't matter that the morality police will harass, and that they're not sitting there asking. And this is what I think is also interesting here, is because we are seeing outpouring of support from sectors of society that normally would not be coming out and supporting a protest against the compulsory hijab, including from religious and conservative sectors of society, including from women who wear chador, because even for them, many of their daughters are not wearing the chador. And it's not like the morality police is going to stop them and say, who's your mother? Does she wear a chador or not? The morality police is just going to stop these girls and these women. And so it's an everyday experience. So Sada, I want to get to you about the connection between that everyday experience, the digital quality of this, the fact that, and I think this is really important, especially for folks who may not know this, but this has been mostly transpiring on Instagram. In the digital world, in the online world, as opposed to the offline world on the streets and the discourses that are happening within Iran. Instagram is a space where what in many ways is sort of like the anti-masculinist culture of Twitter and Reddit. It is a space where it is very female dominated in many ways, very youth dominated. It's a way in which people are communicating with each other. One of the things that I find really fascinating in this movement is the way in which Iranian Instagram influencers and others are using direct IG Live to talk to their supporters, or to talk to their followers on these social media apps, and to really sort of in a very personal and directed way. And I also want to take it back to what you were saying before with the public mourning of it. So one of the things that we know in the Islamic Republic is that when they kill and when they suppress in these ways with people that do not agree with them, they mandate that those families do so in quiet, that they bury their children or their loved ones in quiet and not make it a public ordeal because of these public mourning sort of histories that you're talking about. But what we see here is that the explosion of women, life, freedom, the Kurdish slogan, happens at the funeral of Zhina Amini in Kurdistan, which it's not like people outside of her immediate family were necessarily there, but the recording of it and the circulation of it on social media. And then Javad Haydari's sister, who is, her brother is buried and she's cutting her hair on top of as they're mourning his death. These are very intimate spaces of mourning in a family that become a part of a public conversation and a public rage that then continues this. And so I want you, because you're so brilliant at this, to help us connect these things together.
Well, okay, that's a lot. I wanna just, on that very last point, I think you touched on something so crucial, Narges. In Iranian culture, when it comes to death, private and public space still has a lot of meaning. What I mean by that is, you mourn a normal person, you mourn someone grievable in your private space, in your private home. But if the values, when the question of values comes to the fore, right, you need public space to mourn that person. And so, for example, this is where, again, we get into these conversations of, with my generation, who's a martyr, who isn't. With this generation, I kind of like wanting to also touch on the comparative side of this question that you're asking. I want to talk about the Dahe studies, as we're calling them, so sort of equivalent to Iran's Gen Z, but I'd say slightly younger. They're anywhere between like 15 to 25, more or less, at this point, and they have been the ones leading these protests. And I want to be honest here, I'm not in Iran, and I'm not a Dahe study, and I don't want to be speaking for them, but like you, I've been following them on Instagram. One particular person I want to shout out, her name is actually Mahsa, coincidentally, and she's been sharing some of the most astute and even-keeled and informative posts that I've been seeing as of late. And I'm learning from her, I'm learning from her generation, and think that they should, I really wish we could have a space where we could allow them to tell us what's differentiating them and their movement from ours. That being said, I do think they've achieved some really concrete things that we can talk about. And one of the really important ones there is that if we think of the public space, we usually think of what is within the realm of the sayable and the seeable. That's what makes its way into the public space. But we often leave out the fact that if we want to understand what are the parameters of our public space, we have to get to the limits of the unsayable and the unseeable, right? That's how we understand, what is the negative side of it, helps us see what's inside of it. And these and I'm going to call them kids, meaning bachaha, not diminutive, but just like, the way we say guys in Persian for anyone non-Iranian, we don't say guys, we say bachaha, which just translates to kids, and it's much nicer and gender neutral. So these kids have actually, I think, been pushing the parameters of what is unsayable and unseeable and even unfeelable, I would say, in Iran. I'll give you an example. If we think about how the the Islamic Republic is an ideological experiment, right? We know this. It's a theocracy. What is even is a theocracy? And they've been trying to define this over the past 44 years almost. What makes ideological states functional, what gives them lifeblood, is that they create their subjects or bring people into subjecthood via their institutions, which kind of work in tandem. These are like media, schools, religion. What sets Iran apart, sort of, is that within this religion institution, we have two very strong institutions, one martyred and the other veiling hijab, right? You see signs about these things everywhere around the city, when I say the city, I basically mean public space. And I think that if we contrast the 2009 Green Movement protests with what's going on right now, we see those like in play. In 2009, we didn't take our scarves off to protest. We heeded the call to wear black, actually cover ourselves up even more and mourn the death of our democracy. And yes, it was that dramatic. And I complied. We marched in silence, thinking our electoral institution could be rectified somehow. So we were still playing with the rules of the system. And when they killed so many, including Neda Sultan, our chant became "Khaher shahidam rayeto pas migiram," my martyred sister, I will claim your vote, right? I will take back your vote. We wanted her to be deemed a martyr. We were not thinking outside of those parameters. Look at what's happened right now. They're not asking to name Zhina Amini a martyr. They are not asking actually for, one of the other things my generation is doing a lot on Instagram is like spreading news about who has been deceased, which is so critical as well. But the Daesh are saying, hold on, we're in the middle of this. We don't have time to process grief right now. Please let us just do what we need to on the streets. We will come back. We will account for all these lost lives, but not now. Now is not the time. And I think that's a maturity that we didn't have. But also, again, they don't even want to play by these rules. And this is all sort of like you're saying, also unfolding on Instagram, which I think is so interesting, because if we think of I got Instagram in 2014 on a field work trip to Iran, because Instagram was the only social media platform that was not being censored in Iran. And it was open. It was open. I visited summer, it was still open, and they just shut it down at the start of these protests. Like that was the one last space that people had. So I think one of the other things that Instagram has so importantly done is that, again, thinking of how the ideological state was creating its people, right? They couldn't just get people to foster belief in people by telling them, hey, here are some slogans, here are some visuals, like look at these posters we put up, like wear your hijab, right? That wasn't how it was happening. They had to actually get some bodies to act out the symbolism of the Islamic Republic, and this played out on women's bodies, right? They performed the Islamic Republic. It was a performative in a sense, and I use that not in the sense of something that doesn't happen. We actually, in performance studies, when we say performative, we think of gender, for example, like the thing that when it acts itself out, it actually happens. So I think one of the things that Instagram has done, however, is that whereas before in public, women had to appear a certain way, and so nobody had an idea how other people lived in private, Instagram opened that world up for us, right? You no longer, and I think this is whereas when I was looking at the war generation, I was looking at how in public, we weren't even allowed to be happy. It was in deference to the martyrs, the blood of the martyrs. You did not have happiness in public space. You could have it in private, but then I think of like all the artwork that has come out from my generation that shows how that the after effects of the war have lived on, and even in our like private joys, there's still like a tinge of sadness to them, right? Because we can't do it publicly, we can't share it together. So if we're sharing it even in an artwork, that kind of mourning comes over it as a veil, if you will. So I think one of the things, and we saw the crackdowns on the dances that went viral on Instagram, that wasn't a coincidence. That was, again, because this was allowing for a different kind of affect, by which I mean interpersonal feeling, to circulate. And these affects allow us to reimagine what our collectivity might look like because we share them inherently, right? So I think that's one of the other important things that we have seen. The last thing I kind of want to throw out there, one is I think that, again, this shift from death to life is just mind-blowing and so humbling for me. My dissertation title included the word death and dying. And so kind of like to see it go this way, it is inspiring to say the least. In the interest of time, I won't say more than that. The last thing is, I think that the regime is like fighting a losing battle when it comes to social media. Like, for example, they just arrested Shervin Hajizadeh, who sang the song that went viral, Baraye for ... And they've asked him to take the video off of YouTube. Well, it's too late. Everybody on TikTok is like mixing and mashing and like creating their own versions, and you can't control it. Genie's out of the bottle, right? And that's the other thing that I think like they are, like, this is where you're really seeing that the creativity that is coming out of Iran's Dayeh is building on 4 decades of artists working under restriction. And so they have so much in their toolbox that they are pulling from right now. So, I think this is where I see this moment as revelatory, if nothing else, about where we can expect things to go in the future.
Thank you for that, Sada. That was so rich. So I want to turn it in the last few minutes that we have together to thinking about this moment in what it means for us globally as well. And I want you guys to take this in any way that you want to take it. But Sada, as you were talking about the different tactics, and each of you have mentioned this, sort of the evolution of tactics over this time period. And one of the things we haven't touched upon, and I want to do like a whole different session on this, is about the protest art and the art that you're talking about. So as they shut down the internet in Iran, our communication style today is extremely visual. So when they shut down the internet, what they're hoping for is that it dies down. The conversation around this and the virality of it dies down. But as you said, Sada, Iran has so many artists who are used to, unfortunately, working under severe forms of repression, and know how to strategize to fight back. And so when the internet went down, Iranian artists inside and outside of Iran began to inundate Instagram with visual art that was extremely revolutionary at its core, in the sense that it was about we no longer comply. It was about and it was about bringing a new visual into the imagination of what is possible in Iran. So I want you all to take that wherever you want in the global moment, but I also want to, Negar, start with you really quickly about the global moment, and because I know that you've been talking about this and posting about this yourself, what it means for example, Meta, the rebranding of Facebook. Allegedly, Iranians are pissed off about potentially downgrading the hashtag Mahsa Amini. So what does this mean about, if we want to zoom out from Iran for a second, especially with you and the ways in which you think about these things, like what does it mean about how we communicate with each other and the potentialities around protest when our communication networks are suppressing us?
So I wanted to say that one of the things that is inspiring to me, and what it seems to be inspiring the world, is the fact that this movement is a movement about sovereignty and dignity in life. Like, this isn't about dying for something or fighting for something. It's about sovereignty and dignity in life. And I think that, I want to also connect this to, that's the inspiration for us, but also what is happening to this movement that is about life and dignity and sovereignty is a shutting down of the voice, the ability to communicate. Togetherness demands communication networks. The coming together against acts of repression and violence and fear on the parts of power demands an ability to access communication networks. And so the shutting down or the degrading of the hashtags associated with the feminist revolution in Iran is something that is happening, of course, to Iran, to the protests in Iran, but it is happening for us. It is happening, in other words, to us simultaneously. These networks are networks of communication that we share with the Iranians. So we think this is something, censorship that is happening to Iranians, but it is in fact happening to our networks and to us, which gives certain monopolies the ability to shut us down at the flick of a button. Once this is practiced elsewhere, it can be practiced here. And I just want to give you an example of the tracking of Palestinians by the state of Israel, right? That tracking system was immediately flipped onto Israelis once they needed to track the virus, the coronavirus in Israel. So this ability to do things elsewhere for others means that it can be done to us and for us and to our communication networks at any time. And I think this is super important to notice. This isn't just about Iranians or about women or about some repressive regime.
Thank you, Negar. And you know, one of the things also that activists in Iran are seeing, or people who are being detained is, or not detained, is that the security forces are taking away people's cell phones because they can determine networks much easier that way than detaining someone and trying to like force it out of them. So, and these are tactics that also during hashtag Black Lives Matter and George Floyd, also from Black activists, we heard a lot of that after a while, Instagram and Facebook, they were saying, we're not letting that hashtag come up. So these are things that these monopolies, these companies are using in different uprising movements. So I really appreciate you saying that. Neda, what are you seeing sort of as your concluding thoughts? You have to unmute yourself.
So when lives are taken and the bodies are traumatized and the experiences of those are shared, I think there is a power that also are shared along with that, along with those sharing stories and photos and pictures. And this is something that happened in Black Lives Matter movement and in Me Too movement. Also the Me Too movement that happened in Iran and started before that, like about 2 years ago, and still is powerful. And I think even with shutting down social media and the internet, even it happens like completely. It seems far from imagination, but even if the state succeeds to do that, I think this is the moment that the power remains. I've heard from a lot of women in Iran saying that we do not come back to the era before this movement. And this is something that is gonna stay there. It can flow to other spaces. Social media definitely is an important platform that connects these. This is the first moment that we can see and connect to each other's experiences in that. But also there are other spaces that have been going on. I mean, after 2018, Girls of Revolution Street, that power was flowing into other spaces that was not going that before that. So there were a lot of conversations at universities, at publications that I was reading. So about compulsory hijab. This was something that about a topic that was a taboo to be even talk about that before 2018. So I think this is another step that it makes it so hard to come back, even impossible to come back to prior to that, because it has an outreach to some hearts and minds that might not be taking any position about that before. And by taking those and influencing those hearts, it would be so difficult to not thinking about any change on that. So I think, yeah.
Thank you. SAREH, I turn the floor over to you.
So I fully agree with what Negar and Neda already touched upon. I want to kind of like bring our attention also to the fact of like, how long did it take, if we're thinking globally, right? How long did it take for the people of Iran to learn about the French Revolution? Quite some time. We are in a moment where we're privileged. We get to learn about these inspiring movements, social movements, as they happen, right? So we get to follow along with them, maybe even partake in them in our own ways, right? Or it's, actually, I take that sentence back. I don't want to, that's a whole can of worms I'm not going to get into. But what that also means is if movements like these, quote unquote, fail, meaning they don't yield the results people had hoped for, it can also be a source of despair. So I want to give like some anecdotes, because I've been told that there are a lot of student registrants on this call. One, thanks for being here. This work is now your work too. I've thrice been checked on my ideas of revolutions, and I think you might appreciate these stories. The first of these was by Shirin Ebadi. It was 2008. I just moved to the States as a grad student. I realized she had a talk, made my way there, got to the Q&A podium, took the mic and said, complained, where's my revolution, right? Because like in 1999, the student movements had happened and I had been waiting for that. And I'd gone to college in Iran and it hadn't come. And I was telling her, like, why is the student movement dormant? She said, maybe you weren't looking in the right places. It's not. And a year later, like that same summer when I went home and the 2009 uprisings happened, I was proved wrong. So, and what the protests of 1999, 2009, 2017, 18 mean to us today, this moment, might be very different if this uprising succeeds. Again, define that as you will. Currently, we think of those movements as failed events. In the instance that this movement yields the results that we're looking for, those past movements might actually be reflected back upon as crucial to our arrival at these protests that foreground woman, life, liberty, right? So there are plenty of, I think, wonderful instances of this in the art that has come out of Iran in the past decade as well, if anybody is ever interested about hearing about those. But what I want to say is pay attention to the narratives that you get around these movements, especially if they're like way too glossy. Changing the archive. Go, if you're a student, go to the archives of whatever it is you're studying. Changing the archive is what amounts to changing the future. Go explore those archives, reimagine history, and embrace the archive's givenness to the coming of the future as a future for past not yet taken place, because we are always also redefining the past. I hope we take that seriously and we don't get stuck in these cycles of despair, especially when it comes to these movements. And that kind of brings me to my second note. Years 2012, February, Occupy, hashtag, all happening. Frances Fox Piven, who is also another great scholar in this area on social movements and revolutions. This is a person who has devoted her academic career to studying social movements, called everyone out, not just me this time, and said that we have this very kind of childish idea of social movements. She used the metaphor of fireworks, and then we think the little stars catch all of us and we're all transformed. And that's not how social movements work. Again, there's this eruption, there's that eruption. So kind of keeping that in mind, and then also keeping in mind that you need to engage in, as she put it, I think you need to engage in almost revolutionary strategies to achieve reform. So I fully understand if the women in Iran are saying, call this a revolution, because what they are doing now, they are actually escaping the troubles of revolution, which is when we think of a revolution as a single event. Give me one revolution in history that's yielded the results the people had wanted. There is none, because a revolution is not a single event. The best thing that can come out of a revolution is if people become revolutionary, right? And if they can maintain that. So, and this is where I think we don't have time for it, but this is where I think we can maybe start thinking differently about social media as well. Does it allow us in any capacity to foster revolutionary beings, right? Becomings, actually, I should say. And then the last thing that I kind of want to say, because I like to bring it back to hope always. And this I learned from a mentor after his passing, unfortunately, but he always used to his work was very much, Jose Munoz, was around educated hope. And, he wrote about hope in the face of heartbreak. And this is especially true for activist work, right? Hope is a muscle that you need to keep practicing with. And so one of the things that I remember reading in his essay that really just caught me off guard was that activism is legacy work, meaning we might not see the results in our lifetime. And that is hard to do, to live with, keep hoping for a thing you might not even see the results with. But I used to only think of this temporally. In this moment, I realized that legacy also applies geographically, right? Globally, if we are thinking of this movement, how else are we kind of learning from, picking up on each other's movements? And again, if this moment came out of Occupy, which I attended those talks because I was interested in social revolution in Iran, right? Not in the US necessarily. Yes, anti-capitalism, but it was not my fight at the time. We can learn from each other. And I think that we have to keep passing the torch, because the more of these movements that we have, the more we can keep the hope alive. I think it's important to hope together. And that kind of goes back to the point Neda was making as well. So back to you, Narges John.
Thank you, Sada. That was so wonderful, and I really appreciate you doing that. I want to end on us. I saw people have been super active in the chat. Thank you so much for everyone who's watching and asking amazing questions. And I wish we had more time and we could get to them. But one of the questions I saw, and that it keeps coming up again and again, is questions of leadership. And I think one of the things to forefront, as I want to finish this session with all of you, is that feminist leaders, and we can see this especially because we are in the United States, in the American context. Look at Ella Baker, who was one of the predominant organizers of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. And she was the one who helped educate and organize and activate the student nonviolent movement across the United States at that time. And when people asked her about leadership, she said, what I'm trying to do is to make it so that everyone is activated and we no longer need a leader. When we are working in systems, first of all, that is feminist politics. But second of all, when we are working in systems, especially in a place like Iran that has extreme repression like it does, it is so easy to kill off or put under house arrest, as they have done in other instances, or put into exile leaders of any kinds of movements. And when that's done, it kind of forecloses the possibility of those conversations continuing. What I find personally so inspiring about this particular moment is that it is a moment of eruption in which there is a mass consciousness happening around a feminist slogan of women life, freedom, and around a desire for civic disobedience that is at its core about no longer complying with power. So I want us to, I wish we could go on, and I thank you all, our speakers. I've learned so much. I want to thank everyone who showed up and is watching us and will continue to watch us in the recordings later. And thank you all for being here.